Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Kaur-Khan, founder and CEO of Productable. So glad to kick off this series today. This is actually our very last talk in the Invisible Enemies of Innovation series. Throughout this series, we've discussed some of the common roadblocks to innovation success, including topics like Valley of Death, the frozen middle, and the fear of failure. So today we're talking about our final enemy. That's not how we do things here. And our speaker is actually one of my oldest and dearest friends that I've known almost my whole entire life. And I'm really honored to present Brooke Boyarsky. She is the perfect expert to come in and talk about the constraints of this thinking and what it does to innovation culture, the need for fearless experimentation, and what it takes to have commanders and innovators to actually be able to promote a more productive mindset. So Brooke is amazing. She is an executive vice president and the COO of Berkadia, which is a Berkshire Hathaway company. She is an ex-McKinsey associate partner, and she was class favorite of her HBS Harvard Business School class. So she is a true expert in driving large-scale transformation in these really, really big organizations. And with that, I'd love to hand it over to Brooke so that she can talk about enemy number 10. That's not how we do things here.
Thanks, Rachel. As I told her before this call, source needed on class favorite, but I'm happy to take the title. So super excited to talk with you guys today about enemy number 10. And there's not a place I've worked where this hasn't come up before. I think we've probably all heard the phrase or something like it. That's not how we do things here when we're embarking on a new innovation or a new way of doing things. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys about it today and some tips and tricks I've learned and how to overcome this thinking. First, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the three flavors I tend to see of this. So with, that's not how we do things here is a fairly general statement. And I found that there's a few things that really means. One is we've truly never done it that way before. I find that we've either never done it that way or we've never at least tried is pretty rare, but it certainly happens. So, imagine you've been scheduling flight crews one way for 30 years and someone's coming in and offering a new way to do it. It's possible you've truly never done that way of doing business before. And that's certainly one group of motivators that I tend to see. The second, when people say that's not how we've done things, but here is we've tried something similar and it failed. So, you're not the first person to have thought of this new process or this new product. We've tried something like it. It didn't work out. And we have a real resistance to heading down that road again, right? We probably had a bad experience with that innovation or that type of innovation. And the third way I've seen this come through when we say that's not how we do things here is we're scared of what it means if this is successful. And to me, this is the hardest one to recognize because this tends to be one that folks don't feel as comfortable coming out and saying. But to give an example of this, imagine you're trying a new RPA in finance, a new automation process. And the head of finance is saying, hey, that's not how we do things here, right? We do this by hand. We use these different programs. It might be that person knows that, say, that's 20% of the job of a few of their employees. And they have a real hesitation around what it would mean if that innovation were to succeed, right? What are those employees going to do with their time? Am I all of a sudden going to be forced to rationalize the people on my team? And I don't know about you guys, but that's the sort of thing that puts a knotted pit in the bottom of my stomach. And this mindset is a really important one to watch out for because it's one that is well worthy of being discussed in detail. So these are the three sort of main categories of that's not how we do things here that I'm going to be talking about. Hopefully at least one of these resonates with you. And I also want to mention that while I'm currently in commercial real estate, most of my time at McKinsey was spent in travel, transport, and logistics, planes, trains, automobiles, those types of industries. And those industries all have a lot in common, like heavy regulation, oversight from various industry partners and participants, large distributed frontline networks, And most importantly, I think for this topic, a high cost of failure. I know we have a lot of folks on here on this webinar who can relate to this, but these are not industries where if you change something and it doesn't go well, people aren't going to notice, right? Things like our food supply and millions of people flying, these are areas where the stakes are very high. And it's important that when we innovate, we do it in a way that we can experiment, we can have some failure, and we can do it in a way that's stage gated and appropriate for these industries. So there are 5 steps that I have found that's helpful when we face this kind of situation. So, imagine you have a new innovation that you're excited to start to pilot, or it's in the idea stage and you want to syndicate it with different stakeholders. What's pretty critical here is understanding your own mindset as well as the mindset of others that you're working with, identifying the right stakeholders, having appropriate tools, following a clear and consistent process, and lastly, having built-in accountability into the system. And when you take all 5 of these and you address them head on, I have found that generally you're able to overcome the barriers of folks saying things like, that's not how we've done things before, we've tried that and it failed. This tends to give people a path that they didn't have before. And I'm just going to quickly focus on each one and give some best practices I found. And then, of course, excited to take questions at the end of this session. The first is mindset. And I think it's really important before you can help the mindset of people you're trying to influence, you need to take a moment and think about your own mindset. And this is something I noodle on a lot in my professional life. It's really important to be curious. And that's why I honestly, of everything I have in this presentation, I think this is the most important thing. When you hear from people, that's not how we do things, we've tried that and we failed, we can have, at least I can have a tendency to get defensive and think, no, I'm going to show you we can make it work. And the truth is you should be curious and ask open-ended questions to understand what are the hesitations. Those 3 belief systems I shared before, we truly haven't done it that way, we've tried it and it's failed, or there's something I'm worried about if this were to succeed. Those are really worth understanding because we want to learn from the mistakes that we've made in the past. So I really encourage you to ask open-ended questions. Going in with that right mindset will help the whole group focus on the opportunity. So rather than, even language here is so important with innovation, instead of we're going to fix X, it's we have an opportunity to do Y. So using that language when you're partnering with your colleagues, I think is unbelievably important. And then be willing to adjust. So as you notice that things are going off course, going in with the mindset that we expect experimentation, we expect some failure. And that's why we're going to talk later about the process that we've built in. Having that mindset to expect that and actually cheer that, right? Moments where you're going to need adjusting, that doesn't mean it's going poorly. That actually means that we're learning and we're growing with it, and having everyone buy into that mindset early on will be helpful as you naturally face obstacles, because you certainly will. Next, stakeholders. So once we've got the right mindset and we've interviewed people to kind of understand what's happened in the past and everybody's motivations, making sure you have the right stakeholders involved in launching or trying that innovation. Basic blocking and tackling, like defining your RACI, who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be informed. Once you've written all those people down, watch for your blind spots. So every time I build a stakeholder map on a new innovation, I'm only 60 to 70% right. There are key stakeholders I've missed somewhere on that RACI, and it's a cross-functional team of colleagues who gets me to the right answer. When you do miss those folks, you'll find that often when innovations failed in the past, they missed people on the RACI, especially sort of critical decision makers or critical influencers. So taking the time to define the right stakeholders, have them agree to their roles, So how often will they be involved? Where do they fall on that RACI? And lastly, the cadence of interaction with you and the team is really important to make sure that you have buy-in along the way. Third is making sure you have the right tools. Honestly, this one is so boring, but what I often find is when we do a deep dive of why innovations have failed in the past, we're not doing things like tracking tasks in a way that a cross-functional team can see, giving them that right visibility. So every member of that RACI probably needs a different view, right, to understand what's actually going on in the project. Sometimes I'll see people say, like, actually, we have a really structured big Excel that documents every single task, and everyone has visibility to it, even the executive sponsor of the innovation. They're probably not going to want to read through that. So creating the right level of visibility into that tasks, showing the red, right? Where are we running into issues, making that loud and clear. And again, celebrating that as something that can be overcome is really important. And lastly, investing where it's needed. I have seen more innovations than I can count fail because there was a $2,000 small software tool that was needed, and the team couldn't get buy-in sort of as they got close to the end, right? And that's the kind of thing that having the right stakeholder map, defining as much as you can up front will help, because it's such a shame to miss out on great ROI innovations because we just don't invest enough at the right stage. So we clearly need to follow a process. And I think that this can also be where things tend to go off the rails. You know, you get stuck in an innovation and a problem solving, and maybe you don't know that a workshop is the right thing to do next, right? Or a whiteboarding session. I recommend Productable, of course, as a great methodology, but there are many, right? And Productable certainly pulls on many best practices. But having a plan to say, you know, at different stages of this innovation, we're going to follow a number of processes so that we know that we've got that if we hit a wall, we have someone, an expert, a process, a workshop, a set of questions that will help us navigate those next steps. Respect the blocking and tackling. I can't tell you how many projects and innovations I've seen go off track because no one is helping project manage it. Again, this is such a shame because, you know, making sure someone schedules the next meeting or schedules the check-in with the folks on your RACI, it's something that, again, it's so silly, you almost hate to talk about it, yet it's a place that we often run into failure. And then, as I mentioned, plan for failure. So part of your process should be what happens when we get a no from this committee, right? What happens when the pilot with consumers tells us something we didn't expect? You're not going to be able to think of all of the unknowns, but there will certainly be some known unknowns. And when you raise these early with your stakeholders, I have found that folks get a lot less nervous when they then happen, right? We planned for it. It was part of our process. And lastly, accountability. And, you know, I know Rachel speaks about this at length, but that's not how we do things here. We tried this before and it didn't work. What typically, at least one thing has happened here with accountability, which is normally metrics are not clearly defined up front, and they're typically not agreed upon up front. So, you know, maybe we've got a set of metrics, maybe we don't. We typically haven't created clear visibility into them. Without that, it's really hard to get an innovation over the finish line and really ingrained in a company. Setting an update schedule to say in 2 months, you know, we're doing experiment X, we expect to see metrics Y, and we're going to bring our stakeholders together. That accountability creates momentum and helps keep momentum in a process. Involving those decision makers early so that they're aligned is unbelievably important. And lastly, publicizing the results. And by the way, the good and the bad, I think how you can start to change a culture is to say, here are some things we learned that we didn't expect, right? And actually, this innovation ended at stage gate 2. That's great. You might have saved 2 years of continuing to work on it when the ROI wouldn't have been there. So it's really important to not forget about accountability as you're going through this process, because that again helps keep your stakeholders aligned and keeps momentum throughout the process. I hope that's helpful. This doesn't mean every innovation will be successful, but I think it is a good 5-step process to give yourself kind of the best chance you can and overcome that mindset of that's simply not how we do things here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Brooke. I learn something from you every single time we chat. So it's just amazing to get all of your experience from all these large organizations and helping them innovate and seeing how you can simplify it to this. I can ask questions forever, but so if anyone has any more questions, you can feel free to throw them in the chat to us. Maybe a couple to get started. So I've seen this one a lot for sure, where like you said, RACI is 60, 70% correct. You're halfway through the project, you realize somebody's not on board and they're expecting a lot of things that are different from what you are driving towards. So what's the best way to course correct in a situation like that?
Great question. So first, not tackling it alone. So working with folks who are in the responsible, accountable part of the RACI, I think leveraging them to really syndicate what you're working on with those folks you missed. Because I think what often happens is the innovator, the project manager, they're the ones trying to convince this person that, that this is enough or this is the right way to start. I actually think that often doesn't work. Really starting with someone who has influence, who is super bought in with that person, right? So it might be a VP who is, a coworker of that person. They were bought in because they were part of our RACI, having them talk through the innovation and why we started where we did. The second thing I think is really important is explaining the stage gates. Typically an innovation we start with isn't one we end with. Normally it grows and evolves over time, and explaining kind of the downside of course correcting now, but a path if we think it's the right one to include some of those ideas later tends to help you not lose too much time.
Super interesting. No, that's really helpful. Along those same lines too. So let's say we have that new person that we're bringing on board and they're expecting some different experiments than what we were creating. And now we were curious. So like you're saying from your first step, be curious about their mindset, understand what they're looking for. We do some course correction and redefine that next stage. And then that crazy thing happens where we ran our experiment and it didn't go the way we planned and we learned something new. And I feel like a lot of places that I've worked, if you're showing that you didn't hit your results, it definitely is hard to show and it looks like you did something wrong. And I was curious if you had any tips of how do you separate your own worth from your results? And when I present that, how can I make it clear that the experiment was a learning and not a failure?
That's a great question. Focusing on the opportunity and the problem, not the person, I think is really important. So again, using that language around opportunity. So here's where, instead of like, here's what didn't go well, I think there's a lot more excitement to say, this helped us uncover that there's actually opportunity somewhere we didn't expect. And here's the experiments we're going to run next to better understand that. I think stakeholders better get that. And then internally, I think it's probably something we all work on. I certainly do, to understand, again, it's not, we are not the problem. We're working on a problem, or we're working on an opportunity. That one is probably years of therapy. But I think in terms of how we tell other people, really focusing on what did we learn, not what didn't work, tends to keep people excited.
I love that. I am working on the problem. I am not the problem. I feel like some innovators need that put up above their computers. Awesome. Well, really appreciate all the great answers to everything. This is just always lots of great thinking from you, and really appreciate you driving this whole conversation.
Yeah,
so
my pleasure.
I don't know if there's any other thoughts that you had to share, Brooke, or any last comments.
No, always happy to problem solve. Really love this topic and just love to see all the excitement around it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on our final Invisible Enemies presentation and quick talk. We've put the link to our series in our chat. So Jennifer also said that we'll be in San Antonio next week. So happy to see everybody that's going to be there and say hello. And we will be posting all of these webinars in our blog. So look forward to that soon. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining.
Thanks all.